We'll wait for quorum, right? Yes. Minister of Public Administration.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate this afternoon. A few weeks ago, when I had the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the mid-year review of the national budget, I emphasized that the approach of this government is one of consistency and focus. To paraphrase St. James, we cannot be like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. Rather, Mr. Vice President, it is necessary in these challenging times to play the long game and to have a vision of a future that provides the best for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. It is this vision and this commitment to equitable and just development of our country that motivates us and is the foundation of virtually everything we do and every piece of legislation that we bring before Parliament. This is certainly the case in the legislation before us today. I don't believe any of us in this House or in this country needs to be convinced that we are living in a time of unprecedented uncertainty. Whether it is a global pandemic, a war that threatens international peace and stability, as well as financial and economic stability, climate change, and the increasing occurrence of natural and man-made disasters. It seems that as soon as we wrap our heads around one crisis, another emerges. In this environment, Mr. Vice President, there are some interesting trends and concerns about government globally. Citizens in most countries are expressing apprehension about the future. A global survey conducted by the International Trade Unions Confederation in 2017 found that 71% of participants felt that there was a threat to democracy and that governments were out of touch and not responding adequately to current challenges. Citizens want and expect more from their government. Mr. Vice President, effective local government has a critical role to play in ensuring that citizens' needs and concerns are heard and understood, and that they have every opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to the search for solutions to respond to these concerns. Mr. Vice President, most authorities on local government recognize it as a crucial aspect of perfecting democracy and intensifying participation of citizens in guiding their destiny and realizing community goals. According to the University of Pretoria, local government serves a twofold purpose. One, the administrative purpose of supplying goods and services that can more effectively meet the needs of a community, and the participatory purpose of involving citizens in determining specific local needs and how these local needs can be met. According to the Council of Europe, a good local government system can be judged on whether, one, it encourages the ongoing improvement of the quality of democracy at the local level, two, the government has put in place the policies and tools which help local authorities run their affairs more effectively, and three, there are mechanisms to set and assess whether the system meets the targets of good governance. Mr. Vice President, I propose to assess this legislation before us this afternoon against these criteria. 4 core governance principles jump out at me in respect of this piece of legislation we are considering this afternoon. 1, it is guided by the value that seeks to put citizens first. 2, it seeks to improve the quality of services delivered by local government authorities in the country. 3, it seeks to ensure responsiveness to the needs of the population. And 4, it seeks to guarantee accountability and democratic input in and control of the process of governance by the people for and to whom services are provided. In other words, it is about effective local democracy. Mr. Vice President, I will now spend some time focusing on how this legislation seeks to address those principles. Responsiveness in government is a critical and central tenet of good governance. One of the ways that governance becomes more responsive is by bringing it as close as possible to the people that it is designed to serve. And this is the purpose of this bit of legislation. It recognizes that the people in the community best understand their needs and that the best response to that understanding will come from them. And this is why the bill seeks to amend Section 37 of the Municipal Corporations Act to provide for the holding of quarterly meetings with burgesses to report on the corporation's performance and to address their concerns. And yes, Senator Richards, I do appreciate that the legislation says may rather than shall, and I'm sure the Attorney General and the Minister of Local Government will be happy to engage in a fulsome debate at the appropriate time as to the current implications of those two words and whether there should be a shift. The legislation also demonstrates this administration's respect for the population's right to self-determination and their ability to resolve issues related to their communities. So, the bill provides significant improvements in the governing autonomies of municipal authorities. Mr. Vice President, the legislation strengthens the framework for effectiveness and efficiency, openness, and transparency. It does this by, among other things, introducing a new governance structure through the creation of a municipal council under Section 33A and an executive council under 33B. The municipal council is crafted to be the legislator and policy setter, provide oversight, and represent the interest of burgesses in essence. Among the ways the Municipal Council will do that is by creating and establishing the organizational structure of the corporation and approving the budget for submission to the Minister of Finance. The Executive Council, on the other hand, is the operational arm of the corporation. It will be responsible for, among other things, allocating resources among the various divisions of the corporation, the day-to-day management of the corporation, and overseeing the divisions. The Executive Council will be comprised of the mayor, the deputy mayor, and a team of 5 to 8 members. I am particularly heartened to see the redesignation of the officer who was formerly called the city clerk or the town clerk, because there's a certain perception that comes with the designation of clerk, which is inappropriate for the person who is supposed to be running the affairs of a borough or a city. So I'm happy to see that he is now called a chief executive officer. This is one of the things I try to get PSs in the public service to understand, that they are chief executive officers of their respective ministries. And the responsibility is to ensure the proper functioning and development and growth of the ministry. It is not just an accounting officer. It is not just in charge of HR, but it's somebody who is responsible for the whole operation. So I am hoping that with the change of nomenclature, we have an improvement of how we perceive the chief executive officer and he perceives his role in the new structure of the corporation. There's also the creation of divisions to assume responsibility for various things, including finance and planning, allocation of resources, port, youth, etc. What I also like about the legislation as drafted is that it recognizes that each municipality is different, therefore has different needs and will have a different focus. So it not only allows for the amalgamation of different divisions, it also allows for the creation of divisions not specifically named in the legislation. So it gives the division the flexibility to determine what it should focus on to ensure the development of its municipality. So I really like that flexibility in the legislation. The legislation also provides clear provisions, including institutional arrangements for a division in each corporation with responsibility for monitoring and evaluation. And what we have found in the Ministry of Public Administration, which I lead, is that the concept of monitoring and evaluation is one that has not traditionally been taken seriously, not traditionally been adhered to, but it is so critical a part of a proper governance structure. It is not only essential to ensure that we have the right people to do the jobs, the right types of jobs, but it's also essential to periodically assess what they're doing, how they're performing, what changes are needed. So it is very heartening to see a division in charge of monitoring and evaluation. I note, Mr. Vice President, that this is consistent with Vision 2030 and the government's commitment to measure performance across the whole of government to assess quality of service delivery, benefit realization, and value for money. The bill also seeks to introduce a new Section 34 to give the corporation the power to employ such persons as it considers necessary for the due performance of its functions, to set qualifications for the posts in the corporation, to discipline or dismiss those employees. And the terms and conditions of these persons are to be set by the CPO. And as could have been predicted, Senator Mark sought to turn this into a bacchanal. This issue, Section 34, has raised the question as to what is to happen with persons currently employed in the corporations, public servants who are permanently employed through the commissions. Will they be terminated? Will they be deployed in the public service? What is to happen to them? It is clear, Mr. Vice President, if one carefully reads the legislation, that there is no intention to terminate or redeploy the public servants working within the local municipal corporations. The legislation caters for the continued involvement of the applicable service commissions, and there are two, not one, as referred to by Senator Mark. There is the Statutory Authority Service Commission and the Public Service Commission, and the legislation specifically provides for them to continue to perform their functions as it relates to staff falling under their control, including the municipal police. And for those persons who aren't aware of the role of those commissions vis-a-vis the municipal corporations, the role is to appoint, to remove, to transfer, and to discipline officers of the corporations falling under the purview of the respective service commissions. The Statutory Authority Service Commission is responsible for officers of those corporations which were continued under the Municipal Corporations Act, and those corporations are the City of Port of Spain, the City of San Fernando, the Borough of Arima, and the Borough of Point Fortin. All other corporations which were established rather than continued by the Municipal Corporations Act fall under the purview of the Public Service Commission. And as I indicated previously, both of these commissions will continue to have a role that has been preserved in the legislation. So they will continue to oversee and discipline and so on the officers that they have appointed in accordance with their mandate. What Section 34 has done is to recognize that with the changing needs of the municipal corporation, given their increased responsibility, that they need more flexibility to bring staff on, either for specific projects or to supplement the staff that they have. And the legislation is giving them the freedom to engage those members of staff, and as and when they engage those members of staff, they have the authority to discipline and terminate and so on as appropriate. So it is not dispensing with one to take on the other. Of significance as well in respect of employees is the provision requiring the corporation to establish and maintain a pension plan for its employees, or to arrange for the participation of those employees in an existing pension plan. And this pension plan may be contributory. I cannot overemphasize the importance of government bodies ensuring the retirement income for their staff. We have, the Minister of Social Development will tell you that we have more and more people relying on the social network to cater for the retirement. One, the amount paid as pension will not be under either the senior citizens or the NIB. It's something that will keep body and soul together, but it will not keep the majority of citizens in a position to be able to live like they lived prior to retirement. So it really is important for those people who want to maintain and sustain their quality of life to cater for their retirement as they earn income during the course of their life. And so we need to start ensuring that corporations actually set up these pension plans to properly provide for the employees post-retirement. Schedule 13, as introduced by Section 37, I believe, of the legislation, lists the services for which a corporation will be responsible in its municipality. And these include construction and maintenance of local roads and bridges, minor drains and watercourses, local health, rodent, vector and canine control, garbage collection, recreation grounds and parks, markets, disaster management, municipal spatial planning, distribution of truck-borne water, local economic development, repairs and maintenance to government and government-assisted schools, promotion of local tourism, sports and culture. Now, Mr. Vice President, I can speak at length on all of these aspects, which are all very important, but just briefly on a couple of them. Placing responsibility for many of these. Oh, yes, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, Senator.
Yes, I know you're probably at the end of your presentation, but it's always much more helpful if when you go into a particular provision, if you would just name it for us, it helps us to follow better where you are. You've done it a few times, but that sometimes we are a little, say exactly where you are in the legislation.
Okay.
That's the only fault I find so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. So to repeat, I am now focused on Schedule 13, which is being introduced by Section 37 of what will be Section 37 of the Act once it's passed. So I'm looking at a few of the responsibilities that are being placed in the hands of the municipal corporations. Disaster management, I think, is a critical one because we are too often faced with disasters and troops have to be called out to assist citizens. Now, there are a couple of things which local government, being on the ground in the area, will have a better understanding of than a central government body. The areas of sensitivity that can cause a disaster, and because they have that better understanding, they can more actively react to persons doing things that increase the risk of disasters. So when people build on a riverbank or they do things like that or throw refuse away, you have people on the ground who can react more expeditiously to try to avoid those kinds of disasters, and then can react more efficiently in addressing any disaster that comes. Municipal spatial planning is another important one. We know people for decades in Trinidad and Tobago have been ignoring town and country activity and what they approve and what they don't approve and building. People on the ground, municipal corporations on the ground can see these things as they occur rather than waiting for somebody 4 years after the structure is built to say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't apply, but can you give me approval now, or I will lose all the money that I spent. So they can react more proactively in respect of that. Repairs and maintenance of government and government-assisted schools, I think it's an excellent idea because at the moment we have the Ministry of Education with the responsibility during short periods of break to repair and fix hundreds of schools. And if we narrow this down to giving responsibility to the municipalities with the support of the Ministry of Education as and when needed, then we are more likely to ensure that schools are always ready to be occupied at the time of the reopening of schools, and we don't have the issues with some schools have to be delayed and that kind of thing. So I really like that. I also like the conferring of them of responsibility for local tourism, sports, and culture because we have so much talent and we have so much beauty in Trinidad and Tobago, which is underappreciated, under-acknowledged, and of which we're not aware. So if we place that responsibility in the hands of local government, we have much more of an opportunity to develop and promote those aspects of Trinidad and Tobago. When I think of when I was going to school in Barbados, and these things that were regarded as big tourism attractions, and I compare them to what we have in Trinidad and Tobago, there's absolutely no comparison. But nobody knows about them. They're not promoted, and we don't take advantage of all the benefits that we have. So this will give us the opportunity to get that kind of focus. However, the proposed Section 37.3, which is what devolves all those responsibilities on the local government, reserves the power to the minister who says we are depriving him of his job, if and when it is necessary, in the public interest, to assume responsibility for the delivery of those services. So, as and when a local government body is not able to, or opts not to do what is necessary, then the Ministry of Local Government can step in and ensure that the citizens are not disadvantaged. Once again, Mr. Vice President, the law is expressing the government's confidence in and respect for communities to manage their affairs. As the legislation seeks to place more authority and autonomy in the hands of municipal corporations, it supports this by ceding to them some control over their own finances, by statutorily ceding to them property tax from residential properties within their borders. Most law-abiding citizens, although not eager, are prepared to bear their fair share of taxes, but often lament that they do not see the benefits from this tax spend. The retention by the local government body of tax on residential properties within their borders should allow persons to more easily see the nexus between their tax spend and the services they receive, with the hope being that they will receive an improvement in those services. The bill seeks to introduce a Part 5 of the legislation to address this issue. Under this part, a new Section 77, Senator Thompson-Aye, will require the BIR to forward to each municipal corporation the names, addresses, and assessed taxes for all taxpayers for residential land within the municipality. It requires that this information be kept confidential. Very importantly, it gives the corporation the right and, equally importantly, the responsibility to collect and retain that tax. That is, property tax in respect of residential property. That tax is to be deposited and retained in the corporation fund of the municipal corporation that is established under Section 109 of the Act. The municipal corporation is required under this part, Part 5, to keep an account for all taxes collected and must inform the Board of Inland Revenue of defaulters. Section 108 provides that property tax collected by the municipal corporation is to be offset against approved allocation estimates. So, to respond to a comment or perceived confusion of Senator Mark, the legislation is not giving and taking away. It is not saying you can collect the tax, but then the Minister of Finance can determine what percentage of that tax you're entitled to. No, it is not doing that. The legislation is recognizing that there are 4 categories of property in Trinidad and Tobago: residential, agricultural, commercial, and industrial. Of those 4 categories, the legislation is clearly saying that tax in respect of residential property belongs to the municipal corporations. So all taxes from persons owning residences in your municipality, you are authorized to collect, deposit in your account, and use for your purposes. The other 3 categories of tax, and it may be 2, because there was an undertaking to remove taxes from all taxes on agricultural activity, so the agricultural category may come out of that charge, but all taxes other than that are to be collected at this point in time by the Board of Inland Revenue, although the legislation recognizes that that may be changed at a later date. And the reason why it makes sense to allow the corporation to collect taxes only from residential and to allow the Minister of Finance to collect the other categories of property tax is that because the number of residents that a municipal corporation serves, the amount of property tax that a municipal corporation gets signifies to some extent how many burgesses they are required to serve, and therefore there's a nexus between the two. Now, the property tax legislation and this legislation recognize that the amount of tax you collect in respect of residential property may not suffice to treat with your needs in accordance with the issue that Senator Richards raised. And it makes provision for that because it allows the Minister of Finance to supplement the income that the municipal corporation collects itself by distribution of some or all of the property taxes from the other categories of property tax. And you can see this clearly when you look at Section 109A of the the amendment that introduces a 109A, because it talks to the creation of a statutory fund called the Corporation Fund, and it says this fund will be comprised of appropriations by Parliament, so allocations in the budget in the normal course of things will continue to be due to the corporations, revenue from fees, charges, fines, borrowings, sums provided by foreign states, international organizations, etc. And I'll refer you to these two in particular: residential property tax, which is the tax collected under Section 78 of the Act. And in a separate line, it says revenue from taxes, including property taxes, collected and distributed in accordance with the Property Tax Act. So the law gives the municipal corporation all residential property tax, and then it says that they are also expected to receive money from the other categories of property tax. So the reason why it does not make sense to say collect and retain all the property tax in your area, because that indeed will create imbalances, because there's some areas that are highly industrialized, there are some areas that are highly commercial, and the rural areas will undoubtedly suffer. So we have this pool of income from commercial and residential that can be allocated to supplement what you get from your property tax. And I personally am hopeful that giving the municipal corporations the ability and responsibility to collect residential taxes will prompt them to come on board with property tax and encourage their burgesses to collect the taxes so that they can fund their activity. It is important to note also that Section 109 says that any unspent balances are retained by the corporation for its use. So the municipal corporation is not required to deposit money into the consolidated fund. Money that it gets, it retains for its purposes. So that is a significant part of these proposed amendments. Even as the legislation makes provision for increased autonomy at the local level, at the same time, Mr. Vice President, with real power must come provisions for accountability, for respect for the rule of law, and for the promotion of ethical conduct. I only venture to note, Mr. Vice President, that to whom much is given, much is expected. Over the last 7 years, many of us have grown weary of hearing municipal corporations, which are controlled mainly by the opposition, claim discrimination. The reason why they're not getting enough money is because they are UNC corporations and not P&M corporations. It's what they claim. It mattered not to them that all corporations were suffering the impact of the downturn in the economy, and that everyone from central and local government were being asked to do more with less, to manage their allocations more judiciously, and to reach out to the Minister of Finance in respect of critical needs. But sometimes it appears to be more expedient to launch a protest. This legislation gives the municipal corporations greater autonomy by, among other things, giving them greater control over their finances and how they arrange their affairs. It gives them the opportunity of promoting economic activity within their borders to generate more resources to do what needs to be done. And Senator Richards, I must say, I don't see why it is necessary to specify in the Act that this should be done in conjunction with the business chambers. Somebody who offers himself as mayor or CEO of a municipal corporation should know that he needs to collaborate with the businesses in his area to promote economic activity. But as I said, we will have an interesting committee stage. With this comes the responsibility of accounting to their burgesses for how their taxes are being spent. With this new legislation, the success or failure of the municipal corporations in serving their constituents lies more squarely on their shoulders. They need to bear the repercussions of less than stellar performance. But they now have the opportunity to create cities and boroughs of which their burgesses can be truly proud. So addressing some other of the issues that have been raised by the previous speakers, I certainly do not agree that this bill promotes centralization rather than devolution, not by any means. I dealt with the issue of what is happening with employees. I see Senator Mark was not in the chamber, but I trust that he caught what I said. Both Senator Mark and Senator Richards expressed concern about the autonomy to be given to the municipal corporations and not entrenched in the Constitution. Senator Richards, I will say to you that I'm sure this is something that this government would have been prepared to accept, but when one looks at the history of the opposition and their refusal to support anything that requires an amendment to the Constitution and therefore a special majority, I can say to you that at this point the government is not prepared to go down that rabbit hole with the Senator Mark. We will do what we can now, and as and when things develop, we will see what changes, if any, are necessary. I'm just trying to ensure that I deal with all the issues.
Senator, you have 7 more minutes.
So, just to wrap up, Mr. Vice President, I urge support for this bill. And on the passage, I urge the members of the municipal corporations to put their shoulders to the wheel to build and develop properly served municipalities. And finally, I urge the citizens to become more active but constructive participants in their future by helping their local leaders to identify and resolve the issues facing them and by holding their local leaders accountable for their performance. Mr. Vice President, this bill is long overdue. It may not be perfect, but it is well crafted, having identified and sought to address many of the issues facing our local government bodies. We will probably in time determine that adjustments are needed to the legislation, perhaps the constitutional amendments that I previously mentioned, perhaps to bestow even greater autonomy on the municipal corporations. But this bill is a good start, and start we must. It is way past time. Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Senator John.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to join this debate. Mr. Vice President, the chairman of the Kuva-Tabaki-Talparo Regional Corporation usually starts every presentation by stating that local government affects everything and starts right outside your door when you open your door. This is true, and therefore what we are debating is not a novel concept. I mean, it is all around us. I think as the bill is before us, and particularly in a section, I think 33, which I'll come to shortly, we see the vast grasp or the reach of responsibility that is now on the shoulders of local government. This is nothing new. They are first responders. People call them for every single thing, even before they call their own MPs. Mr. Vice President, I recall, I think in 2018, when there was a huge flood in a community called Greenvale, it affected them particularly. In Las Lomas number 1, where Councillor Balmati Gosain lives, she is the councillor for the electoral district of Las Lomas San Rafael. Her house was also underwater, but she went to look after her burgesses, as they are called, first before she dealt with that 6 feet of water. So we recognize and appreciate the work done by councillors, and they're already taking little to do a lot. You know, councils across the board work very, very hard, and they are underappreciated and, of course, underpaid, as would have been recognized by this legislation before us. So, Mr. Vice President, local government serves a twofold purpose. The first purpose is the administrative purpose of supplying goods and services. The other purpose is to represent and involve citizens in determining the specific local public need and how these local needs can be met. And as I said already, they are many times the first person you call, never mind the problem, never mind how complex, never mind how simple it is. Whether it is you can't get water, or your street light isn't working, or the lights are gone for some extended period, they call their local representative. And local representative government is a process that spans and connects representation and administration at local levels within local government structures. So, Mr. Vice President, when this bill was being debated in the other place, a member of the opposition said, and I quote, "I think on both sides we agree on that, the fact that there is need for reform or need to further enhance the function of local government." They said, "We agree that local government both impacts and touches the people. A lot more could be done with respect to bringing it to the people." So, Mr. Vice President, there is agreement on the UNC bench that there is need for genuine reform in taking the role further. This is, as I said, it's not new, it's not novel. The government is bringing this legislation, but as much as the former speaker said, we have to start somewhere, and I agree with that. But this somewhere, it's really not, I don't think it's a good reflection of where we are, basically. The government probably want what they want. They always get to the end, and then they try to work backwards clumsily. And I think this is what is happening, where we have this very big, very convoluted bill in front of us. So there is some material disagreements on the bill, and Senator Mark has outlined some of them when he spoke earlier. So no amount of amendment within this Municipal Corporation Act, without timely funding, for instance. In a lot of cases, it is funding. There's just no funding, and it's not about doing more with little. People are doing more with so much less, you know. So it's not that. It's just that there is nothing for them to work with, and I'm sure it's across the board. But because of the what is now has become a trend within the PNM, people are very suspicious that maybe they are more affected because they are members of the opposition. They see no equity and they see no fairness. That is the thinking, and basically it's only obvious overt equity that one will remove that perception. And I'm not seeing anything in this bill that is going to remove that, because whereas now there is a certain level of autonomy, there is a Minister of Rural Development and Local Government. Now, all of that role is being removed, and the minister, the current minister, has put it in a very descriptive way when he said he's working himself out of a job. So all of that responsibility is being removed from him and being placed and being centralized in the hands of the Minister of Finance, who I felt was a very busy man. I don't know that he has the time to look after 30,000 people and this very vast role that is local government. So that to move whatever power from this Minister of Rural Development, I said to move it on, I still believe that we have to be convinced that the structures are in place for the Minister of Finance to decide who gets hired, their org structure, what they are paid, and all of it. It is just kind of anecdotal, whether it is in the debate in the other place or within the bill. It is all very vague. There is not so. If it is, we are approaching this and saying it is an incomplete bill and the UNC cannot support it. It is because there is nothing much in here to support based on where local government is at this point in time. So, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Rural Development is claiming he's taking away the bureaucracy and filters from the public servants and bringing it straight maybe to a single point responsibility. But instead of ensuring that this is, again, decentralized, you are going to find bottlenecks, because everything is going to end up at this point, given what this bill before us is saying, because every single thing ends up at the door of the Minister of Finance. I mean, an org structure is ending up there. You know, he's decided who gets what. Whether in terms of this now, what they are breaking up the structure into this municipal part and the executive part, and we still have confusion in terms of what happens if there are 14 elected councillors, then and there is only this finite amount who can be on this municipal council. What happens to them, or who is chosen to be on this municipal council? And then the Minister of Finance is saying, if I have to approve your org structure, if he does not approve, what happens then? Isn't that room again for more suspicion, where someone in a opposition-held council will say, he is not approving it because we are the opposition, or we don't belong to his party? So I think that is opening the door for a lot of further suspicion and for the work really to not be meaningful, as it were. Another point, Mr. Vice President, the government is talking a lot about following the THA model. But again, I don't know how. The THA has certain level of autonomy in how they conduct their business. In addition, they have been before this body called a Dispute Resolution Commission, and they are now entitled to 4.03% of the budget, or 6.9% of the budget. Is it that this is going to, the corporations will benefit from this same allocation, or will they work out some kind of formula where these corporations are going to be funded? And again, in another place, one would have heard about a $30 million sum coming out of the taxes they're expecting to raise from this property tax. And Mr. Vice President, if it is it that the minister has done some kind of projection from the various, the corporations, as it were, or the areas that are the responsibility, these communities that fall under the various corporations, and would have projected what is the probability in terms of an assessment, an estimate of the amount of property tax to be collected, and whether this will be sufficient to run the corporation or the needs of the burgesses. And this doesn't mean that the expectation is that they will satisfy every need. So it's the reason the UNC keeps talking about geographical discrimination. Because when you look at one side, I mean, it's obvious you do straight line math and you wonder, why am I getting this and the other one is getting that? And I think this was a good time to kind of quell those kind of fears, anxieties, and suspicion. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that the people of Trinidad and Tobago benefit from any reform. And because at the ministerial cabinet level, that is more the macro business of the country. The local government, at the end of the day, they are the people who interact one-on-one with the citizens of this country. So it is a role that we have to celebrate and elevate and basically ensure that they are well remunerated for. Mr. Vice President, when you listen to persons on your side talking about when the bill is passed, that each corporation will manage or own or raise or initiate their own revenue stream. Basically, there is nothing in the bill that points to it. Well, I suppose you can't, and perhaps there is some kind of strategic plan that the corporation will be asked to produce every year, and then to account for that. The UNC is not in agreement with the implementation of the property tax, and Senator Mark would have spoken about that, at least not at this time. We are very firm on that this is not the time for this draconian tax to be implemented. So basically, you know, the speaker who preceded me, the Minister of Public Admin, would have spoken about diversification. And I agree, it is that point. You know, we have so many, our communities are so different and they are so diverse. So it's a good mix, a good match for us to start with the diversification. You know, whether it's the waterfalls of Blanchisseuse. I have friends who brag about Brazil and it has the best biking trail in the Caribbean. The beaches, well, I'm from Tobago, so it's almost sacrilege for me to talk about the beaches of Toco because we have the best beaches in Tobago, particularly in Charlottesville. but, at least Toko is nice and serene. I climb Mount Hololo, the Pines of Lady Chancellor, and so many places. You just have every single community in Trinidad and Tobago. It's just unique and brings something to the table, whether it's a mud volcano. Something is just there to attract people. And basically, these are the things within the community that one needs to develop to create a product around. So you can have community tourism. So right in the community, the folks in the homes, they're earning income, and also the corporation, it's also collecting taxes. Because right now, we talk about the corporation having the responsibility to collect garbage, for instance. And the place, sometimes it is just so untidy. And one wants to know, why is it when you have people who are charged with that responsibility? But we'd have heard the Minister of Rural Development speak about, I think, 40% of the equipment are down. And one wants to know, why is this so? And if there is a big move to ensure that these equipment operationalize again. Because again, when a tree falls, they call the local government to cut that tree. If there's a flood, they are the ones at the front line. They are always at the front line. So the equipment, you can't have 40% of the equipment down and believe that just having a bill passed and you trigger that there is reform, that will do anything. It will not solve any problems, Mr. Vice President. By and large, the councillors are saying some of the issues is lack of funding in regional corporation. That is not a secret. Lack of maintenance for the equipment. Poor condition of road leads to taxes increasing fees because there's a knock-on effect. Increase in price of raw materials for construction. Housing, lack of adequate housing accommodation for growing population. So even in their own communities, electoral district, need for increase in social welfare program because they are always that first point of contact. So availability of garbage or lack of availability of garbage collection, lack of maintenance of water courses, flooding, all of these things and on impact on the ability of the people who work within the local government to really carry out a good job. And I'm not seeing how this bill, just by approval, will significantly move this goalpost when we so need local government to work. We need that function to work because that is the one that interacts with our life. So again, I'm very disappointed that we really don't have, outside of property tax, any mechanisms or any ideas for collection of, raising revenues within these very diverse spaces. So Mr. Vice President, one is asking what is the percentage these corporations will be getting if they are utilizing, I would have said that the THA model. How would the minister come up with basically his, how he's going to allocate the funding that from the money he's raising through the taxes? What about the organization structure? Is it that the different corporations, because some corporations are unique in terms of the spaces they serve, they have unique needs. Is it that the organization structure will reflect that? Again, because the Minister of Finance has to manage all of this. This responsibility for salaries is removed, and Senator Mark spoke extensively about that responsibility. How is the minister going to set the level of salary? And it's not that this $4,000, because again, I've heard people talking about the $4,000 stipend. Some people live on it, has been said. But one also have to recognize that within the local government system, there are a lot of practitioners who are extremely well qualified. And if it is the band is going from 4,000 maybe to 10,000 as an upper limit, I say good luck with that. The government then will not achieve its objective, because a lot of people, when they combine the stipend and their salary, they are earning a lot more than $10,000 a month. And Senator Mark would have spoken about given this THA model, what a THA secretary is earning, which is, as he had said, well over $24,000 per month, $24,360 $70, and that's the secretary, for instance, in the Division of Sport and Youth Affairs. Someone in local government has a really wider portfolio and perhaps a more difficult task. An assemblyman without any portfolio receives over $11,320. So if there is going to be comparison, just calling them secretary, but they are not getting the recognition or the remuneration, it makes no sense. It's better you continue to call them councillor and allow them to go out and have their job, their day job, as it were, and they do the councillor thing as a sideline. It is a good objective to say, let them concentrate and focus on that. But one must pay people properly for their labor. Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Rural Development, in his presentation of the bill, he spoke about 80% of the roads for the local government corporation has responsibility for the construction and maintenance of local roads, and that is 80% of them. And I think that is really a significant number of roads and roadway. And as we all know, these roads are in a deplorable condition. Many of them have no owners. They're referred to as, I heard them referred to today as orphan roads. And really, this is something we have to treat with urgently to ensure that the right legal framework is in place, that the Ministry of Local Government can look after these roads, because it's really, really, whether it's, and I mean, if primary roads, secondary roads, tertiary roads, even the roads that farmers have to access their gardens or their farms, those are in really, really deplorable conditions. And if it's a legislation that is keeping or vesting, some vesting order that is keeping these roads in that condition, then I think this is something that needs to be looked at very, very quickly and critically. Again, you know, they're responsible in section 35 of the Act. It has where section 35, that is section, I think, clause 3, section 35, where 35A1, each corporation shall establish divisions with the following responsibilities: corporate services, finance, planning and allocation of resources, internal audit, sport, well, and these are the internal corporate side of their business, but in sport and youth development, recreation grounds and public spaces, public health, sanitation, and the environment, spatial planning and building inspectorate, monitoring and evaluation, community development and social services, municipal police, infrastructure development and maintenance, disaster management, and such other divisions as the council of the corporation, with the approval of the minister, determines necessary. So it's a very vast function, Mr. Vice President. So, and what this bill is proposing really does not fit what the people in local government is being asked to do. And basically that link between us and civility, between the citizens of this country and civility and basic services, and basically just knowing that this country is working. I think there's a wide gap, and I don't know about, as I said, this having the Minister of Finance negotiate salaries. We are seeing people on the streets, so I don't know. Mr. Vice President, there was a minority report which was mentioned, and basically, I'll just say very briefly, it was just a brief minority report, because we were very focused on what we felt was missing as the opposition. And we look at clause 3, which is very convoluted. You know, it's almost the entire bill, and it just goes into it ran out the alphabet, and you can barely follow what it is saying. So maybe that needs a lot of cleaning up. And of course, we have said the opposition disagrees with the property tax being implemented at this time. And basically, people are very suspicious about the equity. How is the government how will they address the equity or the perceived inequity in the population? And this is a democracy. If people are asking questions, it is their right and duty to ask questions. You know, I mean, the government could complain or protest, but that's okay too. But the role of the opposition is to ask questions or to put up their hand and say, we feel this way about whatever. And I mean, it is our right so to do. And then the bill reduces this is part of the minority report, Mr. Vice President, the bill reduces the protection of workers by recognized majority unions. And, well, the point was made that there was insufficient consultation with stakeholders. The minister this morning in piloting the bill, he called out some very large figures in terms of people who had participated in the consultation. And if those figures are indeed accurate, Mr. Vice President, then I say congratulations. And basically, it just demonstrates and underpin further the interest in local government, because again, it really touches every single life, as it were. So, Mr. Vice President, again, I reiterate that this is not, in terms of telling or signaling to the country and local government that the municipal, their various, whether the municipal council, I'm not sure it's called a council, and the second one, the executive council, that they are going to operate as a cabinet. That is not quite true. A cabinet has a lot of autonomy. It really it has the treasury at its disposal. And as we can see from this bill, the local government practitioners, they must go to the Minister of Finance, even if it is to buy a tea bag at the end of every month. So that is not so. You know, we can't excite them by saying you are going to have this autonomy and you'll have this amount of power to do the work that you cannot now do. I think it is misleading them, Mr. Vice President, because what they are currently facing, really, it's a lot of it hinges back to financing, right? And again, it's not because they are asking for too much. There's just no financing to do much of anything. You know, there's just no financing. So the cabinet, as I said, has all the power and controls. The Treasury, they have absolutely no power now, and they will have no power when this bill is passed. It is simply an annexation of power by the Minister of Finance and a centralization of his power. Why he wants more, I don't know, right? The Minister of Rural Development spoke again about digitalization, but they don't even have computers now. So to have that, you have to have access to the devices. They don't have that. There's a big deficiency in it. And so again, even if this bill is passed, there's no computers, there's no hardware. So I suppose the government is going to treat with that as they move forward, because, Mr. Vice President, you will hear various speakers saying that, well, they can't deal with the UNC, so they are going to go by simple majority. And I want them to know that this model about THA, don't mamaga yourself, the THA is grounded in the Constitution, Clause 141A, all right? So it is the Tobago House of Assembly is a creature of the Constitution. And basically all it takes is a little more work to listen to what people have to say, you know, particularly the ones who have to give the support if one is to ensure that you have robust legislation, because that is why, you know, these legislation are so easily challenged in court. And then there's another complaint that the UNC is always running to the courthouse. But when people's rights are being infringed, we cannot allow that to happen and say it's about expediency. So, Mr. Vice President, wrapping up, the UNC does support local government reform. We don't support any kind of this so-called reform. This is not good enough, because this PNM bill does not address the central problem of funding. It does not address the fundamental injustice sometimes of some of these huge, sprawling, geographic location that some corporation finds themselves in, and the Minister of Finance in another place would have kind of addressed that to some extent. Basically, he said what the common denominator is really their residences everywhere, but everywhere will not be industrialized, or everywhere will not have agriculture, and maybe that was a good frame within which to put it. But is it that, again, that only using money from taxes raised within the residential property tax, is that good enough? Will that solve the issues they now have? These are only cosmetic alterations, which changes really nothing, and the real problems of local government will remain, and indeed perhaps get even worse. this bill before us is merely a step to introduce property tax, and that basically is what it is. It's just a way and a mechanism, to implement this property tax. That is what it is. That is the only outcome I see in this bill, is that it's a mechanism to introduce the property tax. The government has shown, beyond a doubt, that they are about centralization and not decentralization. So really and truly, the local government is going to be dependent on the central government. And if the government think that THA is such a great model, I think maybe the corporation, the various corporation or municipalities, their annual budget should be guaranteed, just as the THA is, because the property tax revenues will very likely not be enough to fund local government corporations. And again, that will give rise to the great inequity and inequality as the property tax revenues are collected from areas that are quite densely populated against those that are not so much so. Again, I spoke about having this piece of legislation entrenched in the Constitution, just as the THA is, and the bill leaves the current problems intact, and in fact make these problems, will even exacerbate them and could make them worse, because they are then going to be endemic in the system, with the central government still having ultimate control. Only now it will be in the hands of the Minister of Finance instead of the Minister of Local Government. So, Mr. Vice President, I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Senator Teemal.
Mr. Vice President, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this bill that is before us. And first of all, I, as a member of the Joint Select Committee that looked at this bill, I would like to put on record and to acknowledge the chairmanship of the JSC by former Minister of Agriculture, Clarence Rambarat, and to also acknowledge his balanced and inclusive approach during the chairmanship of this committee, which I think contributed a lot to the bill that we have before us. Mr. Vice President, local government is about communities, and insurance services are delivered in an efficient, cost-effective, and timely manner, and also an equitable manner, despite size, nature, and geographic location. Local government should not be seen as an arm or appendage of central government, but as an organization in its own right, fully conscious of the needs of citizens within their communities, and having the ability and resources to address their needs through service-driven strategy, goals, and objectives. Local government reformation and modernization has been on the agenda of various governments for past decades, but changes have been slow and limited. There is no doubt that local government plays a critical role in the economic development, and an improved and sustainable local government system would be contributing significantly to economic reform and growth. Thus, the legislation before us affords us the opportunity to make a quantum leap in local government reformation and modernization. Opinion surveys done by Market and Opinion Research International in 2002 and 2003 revealed that citizens were unhappy about the key services provided by regional corporations at that time. These were poor drainage, flooding, lack of adequate streetlights and recreational facilities. A report done by Aegis Management Solutions Limited titled Build Capacity, Strengthening Institutions and Delivering Exceptional Service found that the local government system to be a complex one with several areas of overlaps and parallel subsystems. And some of these included political and administrative arms having parallel arms that only relate to each other at the highest levels. Informal systems, processes, and relationships are used to get around formal systems that do not work. And the report also identified parts of the service operate in a dual capacity. For instance, the corporations manage both the delivery of services and also deliver services themselves. Also, the report identified the existence of a bipartisan system, which is manifested through pro-government councils or anti-government councils. In addition to these, the draft policy titled Transitioning of Local Government 2016 by the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government further identified several other major impediments that prevent corporations from delivering services to the public in an efficient, timely, and cost-effective manner. And these included 1, political interference and manipulation, 2, inadequate funding, 3, inadequacy of current legislation, 4, sluggish and bureaucratic administrative structure, and 5, lack of productivity. To these, I would like to add the question of inequity in the disbursement of funds to opposition-controlled corporations by the central government of the day and perceptions surrounding this. It is against this background that we have before us legislation that would bring about a quantum leap in local government reformation. Not only does this legislation seek to expand the existing responsibilities of the corporations, but as we see in sections 35A to 35J of the bill, it adds wide-ranging and significantly new responsibilities that would enable the formation of at least 8 specific divisions responsible for corporate services, finance planning and allocation of resources, public health, sanitation and the environment, spatial planning and building inspection, monitoring and evaluation, a very interesting division that is being created here, community development and social services, infrastructure development and maintenance, and disaster management. Now, the bill does allow for combination of divisions, but with a clear demarcation of responsibilities outlined in sections 35A to 35J of the bill, I cannot foresee much of this happening, and thus we are faced with the distinct possibility of 8 divisions. The draft policy, Transitioning of Local Government 2016, that I mentioned before, also, in addition to these 8 divisions, identified possible functional units within these divisions. Under corporate services, it looked at functional units of human resource management, legal, general administration, procurement, communications and public relations, information and communications, technology, training and development, and industrial relations. Under finance, planning and allocation of resources, the functional units of research, planning and development, local economic development, finance and accounts. Under public health, sanitation and environment, the functional units of waste management, disaster management, vector control, public health inspectorate, environmental sanitation and litter prevention. And under spatial planning and building inspection, the functional units of spatial planning and the building inspectorate. And if I continue under community development and social services, functional units of social services delivery, community, culture, festival, and the arts. And under infrastructure development and maintenance, the functional units of engineering and surveying, project management, fleet management, and facilities management. Mr. Vice President, these functional units, together with disaster management and monitoring and evaluation and internal audit, comprises almost 32 functional units to be established under the respective divisions. And I'm sure when it's looked at in its present-day context, this number may increase. And we begin to realize how broad and ambitious the scope of local government reform is under this bill and the monumental task that lies ahead. Other than the legislation to bring about the reform, my concern is that the operationalization required to get this bill proclaimed and to bring it into reality within the shortest time possible and in a cost-effective manner. That's my concern. I trust that it would not end up like other bills enacted for bringing about major changes, but has languished due to inadequate planning, inadequate transitioning, and starvation of resources. I cannot help but refer to a case in point, the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, which was passed since 2014, and 8 years later has still not been fully proclaimed. In the same draft policy document that I referred to earlier, the only mention of change management is, and I quote from this draft policy, the impetus for organizational change and development brings the need for change management. Initially, highly skilled change managers would need to be enlisted to facilitate the transition and implementation process. However, through expert training and continuous development, staff of the HR units of each municipal corporation would become skilled in the area of change management. Close quotation. Mr. Vice President, in such an extensive reform being undertaken, this is the only paragraph in the draft policy regarding transitioning and change. And it is just not good enough in light of the drastic reform being legislated through this bill. In my opinion, in order to facilitate the expeditious operationalization and proclamation of this bill, a comprehensive policy of transition and change management will have to be developed that also includes for the funding required to bring about the envisaged transformation and within a specific time schedule. It is a pity that the necessary transition management cannot be legislated. But I would like to recommend that a transition coordination task force be established under the guidance of the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government. And this task force, I'm suggesting, would have at least representatives from the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Local Government Authorities, who would represent the respective corporations, the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning and Development, Town and Country Planning Division, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Sport and Community Development, Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, the Statutory Authorities Service Commission, public service commissions, trade unions, and the business sector. At least these entities. And this task force, I'm suggesting, could be mandated to come up with a transition plan that would include a clear identification of the resources necessary to bring about the transition. Each corporation could then finalize their own detailed transition plan using the recommendations and guidance coming from this task force. Mr. Vice President, this would ensure a degree of standardization across the respective corporations, because we have maybe these 14 corporations. If everybody's just doing their own thing, I think it would lead to real difficulties in managing and coordinating the work of the corporations. And also, such an approach would avoid duplication of efforts by individual corporations, thus proven to be most cost-effective. Mr. Vice President, the bill encapsulates certain paradigm shifts for the expansion of responsibilities under local government at present. We have heard from several speakers before me about these paradigm shifts, but I would like to focus, because of limited time, on just a few of these paradigm shifts. The first being the area of spatial planning and building inspection, as outlined in Section 35F. The paradigm shift being proposed here is the decentralization of land use planning to the local government authority, and the decentralization of fundamental regulatory activities, such as development control and planning, usually undertaken by central government. Clause 11 of the bill would seek to amend the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act number 10 of 2014 to amend the fourth schedule to remove the deletion of certain clauses, whereas paragraph D of the fourth schedule would be amended in the second schedule to stop the deletion of certain sections. I have no issues with these amendments proposed, but my concern here is that certain key aspects of the planned transition are linked with the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, which still has to be proclaimed, as I mentioned before, after almost 8 years. The proclamation of this act would have to be expedited to facilitate the intended transition in local government. The human resource capacity at the corporations is woefully inadequate, and the corporations just have 1 or 2 building inspectors to fulfill its current mandate, so much so the expanded mandate. As a nation, for decades, we have not been able to get the system of planning, approvals, and building permits right. The process is lengthy, and based on the nature of the development, could require the inputs of over 10 regulatory agencies and statutory bodies, each challenged by its own resource limitations, and without any central coordinating agency. It's a nightmare. This has led to extreme frustration in the construction industry, as on average, the project cycle is easily extended by as much as 2 to 5 years due to inherent inefficiencies. This has also led to corruption in the system, and it is not uncommon to find building inspectors, planners, architects, and engineers who are employed as public servants within the regulatory and approval agencies, who have established lucrative businesses on the side to facilitate planning and building approvals. And the public, under the pressure of mounting interest charges on their loans and the loss of income due to delayed use, frequently avail themselves of this illegal service. Mr. Vice President, there is no empirical figures, but conservative estimates put losses into billions of dollars. Our nation just cannot afford these losses anymore. It is my fervent hope that the reform envisaged under spatial planning and building inspection, together with the full proclamation of the Planning and Facilitation of Development Bill, would finally get the planning approvals and building permits process efficient. We must note that the legislation calls for all building and development applications to be submitted first to the corporation. And I repeat, now submissions for planning approvals and building permits has to be submitted to the corporation first, before it used to be the Town and Country Planning Division. If it falls under the classification of a simple development, it is approved by the corporation. But if it is a complex development, then it is passed on to the planning authority. Thus, the starting point of the entire approval process is now going to be the corporations. And if this division is not resourced fully with adequate and trained staff, the entire approval process will be derailed, making the situation even more worse than it is at present. Mr. Vice President, one of the key paradigm shifts that came up during the engagement of stakeholders by the Joint Select Committee and also amongst committee members was the aspect of the municipal police. Amendments regarding the municipal police service are provided in Clause AC and Clause AD, but these, Mr. Vice President, in my opinion, do not fully reflect the results of the stakeholder consultations by the Joint Select Committee. The draft policy of 2016 states that in order to improve overall law enforcement and public safety, and generally to assist in maintaining law and order in Trinidad, the municipal police, in addition to protecting the corporation's human and physical assets, will have to become more involved and have day-to-day interface with communities within their municipalities. The draft policy goes on to state further that in so doing, the municipal police must collaborate effectively with the central police to implement strategies for reducing incidents of robbery, gang violence, drug use, domestic violence, and juvenile delinquency in communities. Their intimate relationship with the respective communities would have a positive influence on the detection of crime and criminal activities. Therefore, the municipal police will be trained in mediation skills, developing, promoting, and implementing strategies and programs for public safety in local areas and for solving neighborhood problems, including a system of neighborhood patrols. Mr. Vice President, in addition to the above, let me add the critical role of the municipal police in maintaining civic order in the respective communities. Under the present and the expanded portfolio of the corporations, particularly with regards to public health, the building inspectorate, and even now with the expanded scope, possible instances of fraud that would be transferred with the decentralization of social services. That potential is there. The intention was the expansion of the municipal police officers in each of the municipalities to 100. This would have required a corresponding expansion in their responsibilities and thus improvement on the resulting structure and management needed for an expanded department. Thus, the legislation under Part 3 of the existing Municipal Corporations Act was to be reviewed to give effect to the operationalization of an expanded municipal police department, which unfortunately the legislation before us doesn't fully address. Allow me, Mr. Vice President, to summarize some key aspects that came out in the discussions amongst members and with stakeholders during the inquiries carried out by the Joint Select Committee. One is that the municipal police do not fulfill their obligations and are often unwilling to carry out the directions of the council. The line of command for the municipal police needs to be clearer, as there are statutory protections for their service, whilst there are no mechanisms for members of the public to make complaints about the exercise or lack of exercise of their functions. The municipal police should be appointed similar to members of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, since they exercise powers similar to the police officers of the TTPS. They are presently appointed by the Public Service Commission, which also has the power to discipline and fire such officers. The Police Service Commission, under the Constitution, appointed municipal police officers prior to 2009. Since then, they are appointed by the Commissioner of Police. The role of the Police Service Commission is now that of an appellate body for disciplinary decisions of the Commissioner of Police. There are recommendations for the municipal police officers to be now appointed by the Police Service Commission. However, this would result in a disparity, as the Commissioner of Police appoints the members of the TTPS, whilst the members of the Municipal Police Service would be appointed by the Police Service Commission. In addition, while the Commissioner of Police has the power to discipline members of the TTPS, the members of the Municipal Police Service would have to be disciplined by the executive. The removal of the municipal police from under the purview of the Public Service Commission and inclusion under the purview of the Police Service Commission requires an amendment to the Constitution, which would require at least 2/3 of members voting for its passage in Parliament. There was also a recommendation coming out of the stakeholder consultation to bring the municipal police under the purview of the Police Complaints Authority. This means making the necessary amendments to the Police Complaints Authority Act. Such amendments would require at least a 3/5 majority of votes for its passage in Parliament. So, Mr. Vice President, unfortunately, we have compromise legislation here, because key amendments to the Municipal Corporations Act regarding municipal police are not fully in the legislation before us. But I spent some time on it because I considered it important that it be raised, since it is critical. The role of the municipal police is critical in the overall reform that we are looking at for local government. I'm of the view that the legislative conundrum we are in at present is the reason for the omission of certain important amendments for a proper functioning municipal police unit. Legislation requiring 2/3 or 3/5 majority seem to be unachievable in this present Parliament, and I lament the inability of the parties involved to hammer out a mechanism that would bring an end to this legislative lockdown or legislative paralysis that we find ourselves in. Mr. Vice President, I would now like to turn to the matter of funding. Section 109 AM1 now allows for funding of corporations through the establishment of a corporation fund, which will be sustained by revenues collected from certain services provided by the corporation as listed there in that section, appropriations by Parliament from the consolidated fund, and property tax from residential properties, as well as some other sources as identified in this section. Also, Section 109 AL1B allows for receipts earnings and accruals in the corporation fund to be retained for the purposes of the corporation fund and not to be returned to the consolidated fund. And this is a very positive step here. At present, the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government serves as a conduit through which funding reaches the municipal corporations. This legislation, however, would allow for the power and authority to be assigned directly to the municipalities. They would be required to report and interface directly with the Ministry of Finance regarding taxes, fines, and charges in their yearly estimates and for the purpose of budgeting and subvention requests. The Ministry of Finance, as we have heard from others as well, will now be responsible for the financial oversight of the corporations through internal audit units at the corporations. Internal accounting processes would be established to ensure that all municipal corporations adopt internationally acceptable accounting standards, as well as the appropriate procurement procedures as outlined in the procurement legislation. The corporations would also report to the Auditor General's Department for all monies received and expended. These are steps in the right direction, Mr. Vice President, but it will still place significant reliance on appropriations by Parliament on the consolidated fund, both during the transition to the reformed model of local government and I believe also eventually the fully managed reform corporations. The 2016 draft policy on transitioning of local government also recommended that the property tax on agricultural, commercial, and industrial properties be placed in the corporation fund. The draft policy also recognized that some corporations would collect substantially more taxes than others, should this be implemented, because of the predominance of industrial and commercial enterprises in some of the corporations. The solution to this was that all agricultural, commercial, and industrial taxes collected would be transferred to a municipal property tax pool. And these taxes would then be redistributed to the municipalities on the basis of a commercial and industrial index, which would determine the quantum of these taxes to be distributed to each municipality. This would also bring about a more equitable distribution of funds to the corporations. But unfortunately, this is not in the legislation before us. And I trust that in the very near future, it would be before us. For inevitably, the government would have to give serious consideration to implementing these very measures, as I mentioned before, in the very near future. Mr. Vice President, in closing, let me reiterate my call for a transition coordinating task force to be established to guide this ambitious reformation of local government. Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Senator Laurence Hislop.
Mr. Vice President, let me thank you for the opportunity to contribute on this debate, this local government reform bill. And I also seek your indulgence, Mr. Vice President, to convey my thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley, for the confidence he has reposed in me with my appointment as a senator in this august House. Mr. Vice President, before I get into my contribution, I just want to touch on a couple of things. One being from Senator John, where she mentioned that the government seems to be working backwards. And I want to say that we can't be working backwards when we've had so many years of consultation on this legislation, and that we are now at a place where we can now bring it to the Parliament and to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And the final thing is that the responsibility of local government is not being moved from the Minister of Local Government to the Minister of Finance, but it is being moved to the municipal corporations. And I just want to put that on the record, that it is not that we are moving the responsibility of local government to the Minister of Finance, but we're moving it to the people. You see, Mr. Vice President, what is laid before us today in the form of this proposed legislation is, as I said, the culmination of years of countrywide, island-wide consultations and an amalgamation of thoughts and ideas of countless citizens. And this could be seen as nothing short of a life-changing piece of legislation. You see, many successive governments have talked about reforming the local government system in this country. But it has taken this PNM administration, Mr. Vice President, under the leadership of Dr. Rowley, to take up the mantle from the former PNM administrations, to not only talk about it, but to action it. The burgesses, the mayors, the aldermen, the councillors have been crying out for years for a better system, a better methodology for local government. And Mr. Vice President, I believe that the time has come through this legislation for those cries to subside once and for all. And Mr. Vice President, if not now, the question has to be asked, when? You see, I find myself today in a very unique position, in that my contribution is centered around the fact that this proposed legislation seeks to mirror, to some extent, the structure of the Tobago House of Assembly. Though the system of the Tobago House of Assembly, the system of governance, may not be perfect, it has served the people of Tobago well over the last 40 plus years, and more so over the last 20 of those 40 years. Mr. Vice President, it's with a great sense of pride that I stand here to tout the attributes of that governance structure. It truly gladdens my heart to see our big sister seeking to fashion a system after us. And Mr. Vice President, if this model is good for Tobago, I endorse it for my brothers and sisters in Trinidad, and I have no doubt that it will work here. What we have now in local government is a system that lacks the necessary funding and the organizational structure to implement anything substantial. Those who are in the system know that to initiate a development project, you presently have to jump through bureaucratic hoops, from bringing it to the council to hopefully getting it approved. And then it is forwarded to the Ministry of Local Government, where ministry officers have to then investigate and assess the project and approve it. And then it moves forward to the approval of the Ministry of Finance. And even after the Ministry of Finance approves funding, that funding may still be inadequate. Mr. Vice President, I'm advised that this process can take up to a year. By that time, the project may have deteriorated to a worse condition, maybe requiring more assessment or funding. Or sadly, the burgess who you are attempting to assist may have sadly died. So, Vice President, it is possible to have effective functioning corporations. And the model of the Tobago House of Assembly is proof of that. What you have in the Tobago House of Assembly at the level of the Executive Council is basically a replica of the central government cabinet. The secretaries of divisions are tasked with similar responsibilities as ministers. For example, the Secretary of Health is responsible for the formulation and implementation of policy as it relates to all things health on the island. And so on with the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Division of Infrastructure is fully responsible for all roadworks in Tobago. So an assemblyman who is also a secretary is not only responsible for his electoral district, but also has responsibility for all of Tobago that is under the purview of his respective division. And so if you want to take that into the local government system, the councillor would now be totally responsible based on the division that he or she is responsible for, would be totally responsible for the entire electoral district. Therefore, Mr. Vice President, there is a holistic ownership with the system, greater accountability and responsibility resulting in improved and efficient service delivery. If nobody owns it, then no one is responsible and nothing gets done efficiently and effectively. This is the type of legislation that is needed at all our municipal corporations. Mind you, Mr. Vice President, with this proposed legislation, the councillors, as we said, as has been said ad nauseum this afternoon, that the councillors will now benefit from full-time employment. And I don't know if there's anyone who can stand in opposition to that you are moving somebody from a part-time employment to full-time employment. In that, Mr. Vice President, your allegiances are no longer split between your day jobs and that of the corporation and your burgesses. So you are now given the opportunity to serve your burgesses full-time. And I think all our councillors who stand up in local government and stand up for the citizens and their burgesses will embrace this, because this is an opportunity for them to get the work done full-time for their burgesses. Mr. Vice President, sections 33 to 35 of the bill speaks to the construct of the corporation and its new executive council. And section 35A relates to the establishment of divisions and their responsibilities. And we've listed them this evening. I don't need to go through them again. But what I see from this list of divisions is that this gives the corporations the management structure to more effectively deliver goods and services. So it will no longer be the municipal council that will be held responsible for a road not being paved, but it will now be the Secretary of the Division of Infrastructure, Development and Maintenance. And there should no longer be a fight for a recreation ground in an electoral district not being cut, because the Division of Recreation Grounds and Public Spaces will now be adequately funded and with an organizational structure led by a secretary, which should redound to better service delivery. Mr. Vice President, the roles and responsibilities of the Executive Council are clearly defined, and there are clear separations of duties, as the Executive Council is responsible to the Municipal Council. So it's not a runaway horse that we are creating, but you have levels of governance within this new structure. And it is because there's a similar structure in place in Tobago, you can see and feel so much development. I'm certain, Mr. Vice President, that every time our brothers and sisters from Trinidad visit Tobago, they are blown away by the level of development on the island. We hear the comments, we hear the comments about the quality of the road infrastructure. And all of what you see has been delivered by a local government construct that works. Our community centers and lighted fields and courts in almost every community was built through a local government construct, or community centers. All of this was built through a local government construct. Our health centers, built, managed, and repaired by local government. And when it comes to our schools, it is now in this legislation, but the Tobago House of Assembly knows how to build, repair, and manage schools, Mr. Vice President. The level of development that has been achieved in Tobago by the THA over the years, and if I must say, more so under a P&M administration led by Orville London, during his tenure as Chief Secretary, saw the island move from potential to possibility. His visionary leadership and the citizens' feeling of a sense of ownership created a sense of patriotism that at times can be considered as us being clannish by the onlooker. You see, Mr. Vice President, Tobago can boast of development that can rival any national development plans in the CARICOM region. But permit me to plug here that Tobago has been poised for a very long time to move from a local government construct to an island government system. And were it not for our friends opposite in the other place, we would have been there already. But we cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that Tobago also benefits from being better funded than other local government systems. And this, Mr. Vice President, is what this legislation seeks to address: access to more funding and effective management of the same. Because greater development and more efficiency is possible under this proposed model of local government. One of the key things as well, Mr. Vice President, is that this model will build out your local capacity, your local suppliers and contractors, because the corporations will have a more predictable source of income. There will be more available to them. So they'll be able to better engage small contractors who may be from right down the street, who employs the guys they have gone to school with, therefore causing the resources to remain right in our communities, to build the capacity of our people. And this is what this legislation is about. It is about really and truly bringing government right in the heart of the people. Mr. Vice President, Tobago is living proof of that. The local contractor capacity and pool in Tobago has grown over the last 20 years due to the THA engaging with them and assisting them in building out. Individuals have moved from tradesmen to contractors because this model of local governance aids in capacity building. Who do we think built the schools and the community centers and the returning walls, and even the box drains, and paved the roads? For most part, the Tobago-born and bred contractor, who in turn employs the Tobagonian. Mr. Vice President, I reiterate that this legislation puts the development of the neighborhood, the town, the borough, and the city squarely in the hands of the people who live there, the people who grew up there, and who, better than them, to understand what they truly need. And in closing, Mr. Vice President, there is a local government construct that works. It's not perfect, but it works. 40+ years of delivery cannot be questioned. And if this model, even if it is just a part of the model, is being introduced through this legislation here in Trinidad, I have no other choice, Mr. Vice President, but to give it my fullest support. I do it for the burgesses of the corporation who deserve better service delivery. And I do it for the local government practitioners who deserve better recognition and more responsibility. Mr. Vice President, I do it for Trinidad, and I do it for Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Honorable members, in keeping with our custom, when a member makes a maiden contribution, I congratulate Senator Laurence Hislop on his maiden contribution. Congratulations, Senator Nakhid. I've given you a revised start here.
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute on this local government reform bill. Unfortunately, I have to speak about the contribution by the previous senator, even though in his maiden contribution, I was quite happy to know that he spoke in such glowing terms about the progress of Tobago and the excellent governance, and I'm happy to know that the PDP is well represented here in the Senate, because after that decimation of 14-1, that governance that he touted about PNM in Tobago, obviously there's a disconnect with the ground in Tobago. And what is local governance reform, Mr. Vice President? One does not have to go far into this bill to discover what is the perennial nemesis of this government. It lies within the very name of the bill itself. Government, governance. Every single bill that this government proffers is an exercise, in my opinion, in revisionist history, replete with the typical crass political opportunism that this People's National Movement is famous for. And I've asked many times in this chamber, as one or another of their members drone on about the opposition being obstructionist, as if we are living in an alternate reality to the people on that side. As I repeat, isn't this the same party that has subjected the people of this country to their mode, their method of government and governance for 47 years of 62? So, Mr. Vice President, if these constituencies, the management of them, the infrastructure within them, the maintenance of them, is crumbling, shoddy, inefficient, wasteful, sometimes non-existent, then who is to blame? So to hear this PNM tout local government reform as their new mantra, very much like they touted the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority as a magic solution to a bloated duopoly that they engendered and proliferated over 49 years of PNM governance. And then again, it reminds me of the pepper spray legislation that they have yet failed to operationalize. So when they come and they talk about this and talk about the UNC being against it, well, we are against it for a reason. Because we know the track record of that side. And we go back again to the Children's Authority, which they failed to properly monitor to ensure resources optimally used, homes were not properly licensed, and most importantly, the most vulnerable children of our country were not properly secured. So they can't come to us and talk about a local government reform bill like if they came into power 2 years ago. They have been here for the last 7 years and 47 of 62 years. And they come beating their chest with this holy grail of reform, local government. But wait a minute, wait. Was the system that you're seeking to replace legislatively defective? Or were the gaps, inefficiencies due to poor implementation as a result of incompetence, corruption, stifling nepotism, and wastage? Else everything else is just mere words on paper. And as opposed to what Senator Hislop was saying, Mr. Vice President, legislation doesn't mean action. Action happens when you implement, when you connect with the ground. when you actually put those words on paper and turn them into measurables, deliverables. And that is what this government consistently, time and time again, fails to do. Every single issue, Mr. Vice President, that now belies and bedevils our country can inevitably be traced back to PNM roots. Imagine the irony of ironies. This government, the hypocrisy is overbearing. That at an energy conference today, the keynote address.
Mr. Vice President, point of order 46-1.
Upheld for relevance.
Relevance, Mr. Vice President.
Well, you need to bring it. You need to bring it in. You've been going pretty wide on the.
No, well, I'll bring it in to show that the local government reform that this government now holds up as a holy grail is not reflected in the actual track record. And I continue that you will have a keynote address delivered at an energy conference by the very man who shut down the highest energy earner of the country. That is the irony of ironies.
Mr. Vice President, once again, 46-1, relevance.
Senator Nakhid, you're not being relevant to the debate. I would like to remind you that this is a debate on local government reform. You go batting way out of your crease. Please come back in.
Well, let me come back in by saying this. When one hears of reform, one would have thought that the senator would know that when we look at the statistics, they would have first addressed the alarming geographic discrimination that takes place in those corporations. We look at Port of Spain City Corporation with a population size over 37,000, and their dollars per day for each Burgess, $16. Then we look at Cuba Tabakit Talparo Regional Corporation with over 178,000. And it's $2 per day per Burgess. You would have thought, it's here in the statistics, and you would have thought when they speak about reform, they would address that sort of geographic discrimination. You would have thought it would be something that relates to the ground. But as usual, they come here waiting to raise standing orders. They want to have their way and not let us have our say. And what we seek to do is bring it to the attention that their inane, irrelevant suggestions, amendments in government reform must not only be on paper, but be something that is relevant to the citizens of this country. And this is where we come to delivery, Mr. Vice President. Because as I said before, local government must be about deliverables. What can be done to improve the lives, the daily living situation of constituents, citizens of this country? So let's look at a much maligned, and in these austere times, the now widely hated property tax, which is in Clause 10. To hear this finance minister talk flippantly about the cost, opining that it might total maybe at the low end about $200 a month. Yes, for this finance minister, $200 might be disposable income, discretionary spending. But for the poor and working class people of this country, those in the rural areas, putting up their stalls to sell some starch mango or some Julie mangoes by the roadside to be able to buy their children school uniforms. For those in the east-west corridor who have to throw a curry queue, a barbecue, a raffle, just to make ends meet, just to ensure that we can have food on the table. $200 is not disposable income or discretionary. It's necessary income. It's the difference between children going to bed hungry or enjoying a good night's sleep. Don't forget, $200 a month is $2,400 a year. That is sizable. It's a difference between a single mother deciding which child to buy that school uniform for, or which book to buy for which child. That $2,400 a year is more than a skimpy, to use a phrase, as a word from one of their speakers, poorly planned and distributed food grants. It's more than that. So if they were happy to give people $1,500 school grants, they cannot scoff at $2,400 a year. And grants, until now, we have said on this side, nobody seemed to receive. Confirmed that it seemed fraudsters within the ministry were stealing the people's money. So we have cabinet ministers of this government recusing themselves at the top end, while workers within the ministry defrauding the government at the lower end. So we have rape at the top and rape at the bottom of the ministry. And we know that rape didn't stop at the Treasury. So who is suffering? The poor and the working class people, comprised mostly of the two major shareholders of this country. So this government could find $136 million for a review committee to look into a task force report, but can't find money for local government. Another way with the property tax to further impoverish the poor and working class people. And then we come to the amendment of Section 108 of the MCA, the Municipal Corporation Act. And I quote, to now require councils to submit the yearly estimate of expenditure for the corporation to the Minister of Finance directly, rather than through the minister with responsibility for local government. And we would have thought that local government reform would be an exercise in decentralization. Who would have thought? An exercise that they touted as giving more discretion, more autonomy to local government would be another way to further consolidate this Minister of Finance in his position as the owner and conqueror of all that he sees financially. So how can you be talking
Senator Nakhid, you've been making broad statements about party and party lines, okay? But now you're bringing it into an individual. And I'm going to remind you of Standing Order 46.6, the imputation of improper motives.
Improper motives, Mr. Vice President.
You're challenging the integrity of an individual who is a member of cabinet.
I said he has been given...
You need to... no, you didn't say that. You didn't say that. You did not say that. Proceed along the local government reform bill, please. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate, Mr. Vice President, your guidance, but not those on that side.
I'm glad you appreciate it, so just stick to the topic, please.
So we have all of these amendments, the one I quoted before, and we have Section 112. Again, the Minister of Finance has the power to consent to the allocation of the surplus of the corporation funds. 115, 116, Minister of Finance to authorize the signatures of checks and receipts. I mean, again, who is this government trying to fool? This is a government that speaks on both sides of their mouth. And that is why Tobago completely rejected them, and that is why Trinidad also will reject them. Section 120, Minister of Finance again can approve the allocation of money to other purposes. Listen to this. Other than those to which such monies were allocated under this act. Mr. Vice President, this, as I said, is eerily reminiscent of several manipulations by this government to establish a monopolization of financial power without the necessary checks and balances for this Minister of Finance. So they are touting local government reform, but their actions are indicating local government monopolization. Again, same old, as my father used to say, same old, same bold, with this intellectual and morally bankrupt government. Who can forget the former Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, Clarence Rambert, who left a whole work to be with his family, then forgo his family for half a work.
Vice President, 46.1. That is not relevant to the bill that is before us.
46.1 for the third time to the debate is being ruled. The relevance to the debate, to the bill.
Spoke about decentralization, but in truth and in fact, it's more centralization because under this, the former Minister of Agriculture, they established a single point land management authority. I'm just showing, Mr. Vice President, that their record, their track record, indicates something completely different than what they tend to purport in this chamber. Would anyone want to give us on that side an update on that single point? Land Management Authority, by the way. How's that going? Going good? Senator Defritas? Another distraction. Another bogus initiative.
Mr. Vice President, on a point of order, Standing Order 46.1, the member is being totally irrelevant.
Senator Nakhid, this is the fifth time in your 20 minutes, under 20 minutes, that the same 46.1 for relevance is being invoked and upheld. I ask you to not make it a fifth. Can you keep the debate to the reform of the local government bill, please?
Well, one would have thought, Mr. Vice President, that in showing that in truth and in fact it's not really reform, but the same old, same bowl, there would have been some latitude. But I continue. They continue to deliver nothing to the people in the form of governance. Only these bogus initiatives, as I just outlined. So now we have the newly minted Minister of Local Government, former Attorney General, and all of a sudden now we hear a new secondary road and rehabilitation company to the tune of 100 million. We are according to the Guardian of May 14th, 2022, this new company, not yet registered, no board members appointed, but 100 million allocated to, according to them, capitalize and establish it. And who's responsible for that? The Honorable Prime Minister. When asked about this new company, because again, we are trying to deal with some decentralization. When asked about the new company and its scope, the Minister of Finance could provide no new information and repeated that the new company was to rehabilitate and improve secondary roads. Then we have the audacity of this government to tell the nation that $736.2 million was spent on roads and bridges in 2021. and that is from the Minister of Works and Transport. $736.2 million was spent in 2021 on roads and bridges. And anyone here with any knowledge of the roads in Trinidad would know that's a hard one to believe, given the state of the roads that we encounter every single day. I mean, even in Deoroop Martin West, the roads are atrocious. And you want to put that road under a new company, under the person responsible, the member for Deoroop Martin West. I don't know where more we could go with this government. And now we come, Mr. Vice President, to a contribution, I must mention it in closing. I went to the Hansard and listened to, in the other place, the contribution by the Minister of National Security on this self-same bill. And I must mention, Mr. Vice President, that in my short time in the Senate and in the Parliament, it was probably the most misogynistic submission.
46-6.
46-6 upheld. You need to also be warned of, yes, 46-4 as well. The language is not necessary. Get to it's unparliamentary, and I would like you to get to the content of the debate as it applies to the bill at hand.
Commenting on a contribution by some.
You're bridging on running commentary as well, which is another standing order. I don't want to have to invoke on you, sir.
Well, Mr. Vice President, I again thank you for your guidance and your repeated guidance. So, in closing, Mr. Vice President, we realize that quite easily we can make a confident assertion that this local government reform bill that this government holds up as the eureka moment in local government is nothing more than what, as a matter of fact, it highlights the lack of implementation in the 47 years that they have governed this country at all levels. It highlights the duplicity. It highlights the lack of intention to actually give autonomy to the constituencies and the corporations. And we lament the fact that this government has not yet gone the way of PNM in Tobago. And we know that will come to pass very soon, Mr. Vice President. I thank you for your time. Thank you.
Senator, the Honorable Renuka Sagramsingh-Sooklal, Minister in the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me in this debate. Mr. Vice President, in the very short time that I have, of course, there are some points that I would want to make relative to the bill itself. But of course, I have to begin by responding to some of the points made by those speakers before me, particularly those on the opposition bench. Now, it's unfortunate that I have to come directly after Senator Nakhid. Usually, during the course of a debate, I would pull my paper and pen out and make copious notes of points that I believe is relative to the discussion or the debate and then response. Unfortunately, Mr. Vice President, my paper is still very much blank because that is the extent of the contribution made by the Honorable Senator. Respectfully, Mr. Vice President, I want to remind Senator Nakhid, this is not your Monday night forum. My apology, Monday night forum, Mr. Vice President. This is not the Monday night forum. We are here to discuss the people's business. We are here to discuss law. We are here to discuss policies. And that is what I intend to do. So that is the extent, Mr. Vice President, of the contribution in my summation made by Senator Nakhid. Now, of course, Mr. Vice President, before I get into the crux of my presentation, there were certain points made by Senator Mark. And before I do that, of course, I want to recognize the work of the independent Senator Teemal, and of course, his contribution showing, of course, this country and explaining to this country the revolution that this bill intends to bring in the arena of local government. As it relates to Senator Richards, it is my humble view that Senator Richards would have proposed a significant number of amendments, and I know the Minister of Local Government in his piloting of this bill would have indicated and given an assurance that at the committee stage he will get into those issues, and of course I would leave that for that Honourable Minister to deal with. As it relates to Senator Mark in particular, Senator Mark, Mr. Vice President, is true to form. Senator Mark indicated the Minister of Finance looms large and is in charge. Why is the Minister of Local Government being removed from directing local government and the Minister of Finance is being placed there? Now, there seems to be an obsession with Senator Mark and this Minister of Finance. And because every time Senator Mark comes to this house, comes to this chamber, his focus is always on this Minister of Finance. And I believe it was critical at this point. I know in previous debates, the then Attorney General would have reminded the people of Trinidad and Tobago of the constitutional role and the legal function of the Minister of Finance. But it seems respectfully that Senator Mark, who has been in this parliament for umpteen years, decades, seems to forget that this Minister of Finance, his responsibility and role to protecting the public purse is entrenched in our Constitution. Now, Senator Mark, Mr. Vice President, stated that we are creating a lot of confusion. He made reference to Clause 3, Paragraph U, which seeks to insert a new subsection 38, 2 and 3, and he quoted that the mayor is a politician and the CEO is a public holder. Now, Mr. Vice President, I want for the benefit of the listening public and, of course, to place on the record that the formulation used in crafting this provision was taken from the legislative matrix set out in Section 85 of our Constitution, Mr. Vice President. This section states that the minister shall exercise general direction and control over the department, and subject to such direction and control, the department shall be under the supervision of the permanent secretary. And I know the Minister of Local Government did make mention of this Section 85. So again, it is just for the benefit of the public to understand what we have legislated today is consistent with this Section 85 provision of our Constitution. Now, in this regard, Mr. Vice President, we see that the Minister has administrative responsibility for the department under his portfolio to which he was assigned. And we also see, Mr. Vice President, that the permanent secretary acting under such direction and control must supervise that same office under whose remit the minister lies. Now, let's come back to the bill that appears before us. Based on the current scenario, Mr. Vice President, presented in Clause 3U, proposed Section 38(2), the CEO being equivalent to a PS, Mr. Vice President, is required to supervise the requisite municipal corporation, whereas the mayor constituting the municipal council is responsible for the administration of same. So what we have created here has not departed, Mr. Vice President, from what exists in our Constitution already. So as far as I'm concerned, this is good law. It is not convoluted. Now, Mr. Vice President, during the course of listening to this debate, of course, being a lawyer by practice and, of course, going through some cases. I was fortunate to come across this particular case, and it's called Jones Collins. That was the plaintiff, and it's against the Minister of Finance. It's an Irish case, Ireland, and the Attorney General. It's a 2016 case. Now, Mr. Vice President, in this case, and if I may read briefly from the case, the plaintiff argued inter alia that the Minister of Finance exceeded the powers conferred upon him by the 2008 Act in providing financial support beyond the date prescribed by ministerial order, insofar as the 2008 Act permitted the Minister of Finance to incur liability without any financial limit. The plaintiff argued that it violated the fundamental allocations of power within the constitutional scheme and represented an abrogation of a key parliamentary function, the approval of expenditure, and so on. Now, Mr. Vice President, it was held that the powers of the minister to provide financial support were significantly constrained to the legislation, and while the limits placed upon the exercise of those powers did not include a financial cap, the Constitution did not expressly or by implication require such a limit. Now, what the Constitution required was that the functions conferred by it upon the organs of the state must be exercised by the appropriate organ and no one else in a manner prescribed by the Constitution or in no other way. Now, let's come back to this bill. Similarly, Mr. Vice President, so that's what that case would have stated. The case, as I said before, is Joan Collins. Now, against the Minister of Finance, the Attorney General, it's an Irish case. Similarly, Mr. Vice President, under Chapter 8, Section 113(1) and 2 of the Trinidad and Tobago Constitution, and under Section 3 of the Exchequer and Audit Act, Chapter 6901, which Senator Mark is aware of, I am sure, the Minister of Finance isn't restricted in the way in which he exercises his powers. Legislation, Mr. Vice President, allows for the Minister of Finance authorizing expenditure from the Consolidated Fund and control and management of public finances. The provisions do not, Mr. Vice President, limit the Minister of Finance in the performance of his duties. As a matter of fact, the role of the Minister of Finance is quite extensive, and it is him and him only who oversees and controls the finance and accounting portfolio, Mr. Vice President, of the government. So the Minister of Finance, Mr. Vice President, for the benefit of the listening public, even though he's inserted throughout this bill, he does not loom large and is in charge. What he is simply doing is acting within his constitutional and legal responsibility. These are things that within his portfolio, Mr. Vice President, respectfully submitted, he is able to do. Now, that in a nutshell addresses one of the issues. Actually, the crux of my presentation would also get into some of the other functions of this Minister of Finance, because I know the fear-mongering that Senator Mark wanted to promote by that statement of the Minister of Finance being in charge and all of that. So I will get into that later on in my presentation. Now, quickly, Mr. Vice President, if I may look at what Senator John, 1 point, Senator John, or 2 points as a matter of fact, that Senator John would have alluded to in her presentation. Senator John alluded to the issue of bureaucracy. She stated that everything is going to end up at the door of the Minister of Finance. Now, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance is a key functionary who is responsible in the control and direction relating to financial affairs of the state. And of course, I would have already alluded to Section 3 of the Audit and Exchequer Act and Section 1131 of the Constitution. So therefore, Mr. Vice President, respectfully, in response to the Honourable Senator's concern, we cannot override the authority of the Minister and give ultimate control of estimates, for example, and revenues and expenditure to the corporation itself. This has to be something that has that level of oversight by the Office of the Minister of Finance. Therefore, Mr. Vice President, to say that this bill creates bureaucracy, in my respectful opinion, is frivolous and it has no merit. Now, another point that Senator John would have alluded to, Mr. Vice President, She stated that she was very disappointed that we do not have, outside of property tax, any mechanism for raising revenue within this very diverse space. Now, to answer this, Mr. Vice President, again, and to place on the record, it requires us to look at Clause 3AM, proposed Section 109, 1A subsection B, the corporation, which speaks to, Mr. Vice President, the creation of a corporation fund. Now, this corporation fund shall not only constitute property tax, but it also incorporates revenues from fees, charges, fines, and so on. And then, of course, the bill goes on to speak about other avenues that would be available to the corporation as it relates to borrowing and so on, as it relates to raising funds. So, for example, if I'm to give a simple example, and of course, I know the argument may be raised, this, in essence, may not raise a lot of money, but this is just a simple example. If we look at Clause 3, for example, in the bill that appears before us, Clause 3BT, subsection BT in particular, municipal police, for example, would be able to issue tickets under the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Enforcement and Administration Act. Now, of course, these fees can serve on the issuance of this ticket. While, as I do understand, it's not a substantive amount of money, a substantial amount of money, it is yet an avenue that is available for the raising of funds and fees and fines and so on within the corporation. So briefly, Mr. Vice President, that is just to address some of those concerns raised by Senator John and Senator Mark. Of course, so as I jump into the crux of my presentation, Mr. Vice President, I want to say that I am from La Pastora, Santa Cruz, Mr. Vice President, Blasney Road to be exact. And Blasney Road is a very, very small village nestled in the northern range of Trinidad and Tobago. And I think once you live in a village or grow up in a village, you truly understand the role that a councillor plays in that village and the importance of a councillor in that village. To be quite honest, growing up, our issues, Mr. Vice President, really ranged from, getting the savannah grass cut, advocating for a walking path around the savannah. Growing up, truck water was an issue, as getting water, was an issue. And what I can say, Mr. Vice President, of course, one of my major reasons for supporting this bill is even back then recognizing and growing up as a village girl and understanding the importance that councillor, that first point of contact with somebody who you feel have some kind of power and some kind of authority to bring about some change in your life. Growing up in that village setting, of course, you understand the importance of that councillor. And I was fortunate, Mr. Vice President, to have councillors such as Mr. Henry Nicholas, Linda and Lara, all PNM councillors who significantly contributed to our village and, of course, the kind of life we enjoyed. But I will say, Mr. Vice President, it was only in 2016, however, that I really had an eye-opener into the internal runnings of local government. And that, Mr. Vice President, was because in 2016, my very own brother, Deoroop Sagramsingh, was called to serve as an alderman in the Sawa Laventille Regional Corporation. And it was only through my brother I was actually able to understand. So while before, my interaction with my councillors was, okay, they work so hard and you understand what they do. It was only through my brother I was able to understand the pressure that sometimes these councillors have to go through in an effort to deliver a service. And it was through my brother I became even more grateful for some of these councillors and the effort and the extent to which they went to ensure that the needs of their burgesses were met. And Mr. Vice President, I will say, even from my own brother's experience, and councillors I'm sure will agree, that there's your formal responsibilities and there is your informal responsibilities. And sometimes the informal responsibilities trump those formal responsibilities. So, for example, in a village, there's a death in a family, you'll call your councillor, what are you giving us? You're going down the road and them boys bubbling a pot, councillor, what are you giving giving us? What you buying for us? You know, and all of my brother's home, for example, I know there's no limit to the time frame in which people come to his home with issues. And the reason why I'm raising this, Mr. Vice President, before I start the crux of my presentation, it will be remiss of me if I do not, before the public, thank all of our local government councillors for the contribution that they continue to make.
Rule 46.1.
Senator, you've taken a long run up to the board of the point of order relevance. Can you start to come into the after a long
President,
day?
I'm guided. I think Senator Mark got a little blows just now, so he jumpy right now. But I will get into the crux of my I will end my run up and I'll come back to the bill, Senator. So, Mr. Vice President, what I can say, what I would look at, Mr. Vice President, is, of course, I will delve I would delve now into some detail into this Minister of Finance again, even though I would have, briefly tried to respond to some points made by Senator Mark. Now, the parts of the bill that we would be looking at is proposed Section 37, proposed Section 108, 113, 116, 118, 119, and 120. Now, in a nutshell, these sections, Mr. Vice President, what we have found is that the Minister of Finance is inserted in some of these sections, and of course his responsibilities as it relates to the operation of local government is evident. But in answer to that, I would have already highlighted what was the operating factor or the operating point of law in our minds as it relates to the Constitution 113 subsection 1 and 2 of the Constitution, which speaks to his responsibility and more so the responsibility of the Minister of Finance in Section 3 of the Exchequer and Audit Act. Now, Mr. Vice President, what I want to now look at is Clause 3, Paragraph S, which is proposed Section 37 of the bill that appears before us. Mr. Vice President, this proposed Section 37 makes reference to Schedule 13, which outlines the responsibilities of the municipal corporation. Under Section 13, a municipal corporation is responsible, we know, for things such as the construction and maintenance of local roads and bridges, local health, food inspection, garbage collection, you name it, that Section 13 explains their responsibilities. Now, Mr. Vice President, in looking at these responsibilities, what is common is that each and every one of these responsibility is a service provided by the municipal corporation to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, it is important, Mr. Vice President, to note that it is our obligation as a government to adhere to the needs of all citizens by making provisions for the Minister of Finance, especially where it's necessary circumstances to intervene. Now, for example, Mr. Vice President, we are allowing, this bill allows the Minister of Finance to intervene in the Schedule 13 performances of the corporation, but we must remember the context in which this will happen. For example, if there is a public health emergency, Mr. Vice President, if there's a natural disaster, Mr. Vice President, issues of an infrastructural or environmental nature, Mr. Vice President. These are some of the circumstances in which you will want the Minister of Finance to intervene so that he can approve and okay the necessary finances ASAP, rather than having to go through a long process before that request even reaches to him. So yes, when we look at this particular clause, we are inserting the Minister of Finance into that schedule of responsibilities that usually falls within within the ambit or control of the municipal corporation. Yes, we have inserted him there, but we have to remember that life is not static, it is dynamic, and there will be instances in which you would want him to be inserted in this schedule, because of course that is what will allow for the faster delivery and more so access to funding by these municipal corporations. Now, Mr. Vice President, if I may now look at proposed section 37(3), it says, notwithstanding subsection 1, the minister, where he determines necessary in the public interest, take responsibility for the delivery of service in respect to those matters in the 13th schedule, which I would have already identified. So, in essence, Mr. Vice President, this insertion of the Minister of Finance, I just want to indicate, it bolsters his responsibility in controlling and management of public finances, which again further eliminates any red tape from the process. Now, if I may respectfully turn to clause 3, Mr. Vice President, at paragraph AL, it's proposed section 108 of the Municipal Corporations Act. And it appears, of course, at clause 3 in the bill that appears before us. Now, Mr. Vice President, again, we see the Minister of Finance inserted here. Now, the proposed section 108 and 113 provides for the removal, Mr. Vice President, in my words, of a middleman, whereby there is now an ease of access in which each council, Mr. Vice President, can go directly to the Minister of Finance for cases, for example, let's say ensuring funds are accessible, Mr. Vice President, facilitating a quick approval process, having an effective mode of service delivery, and the list goes on. So again, by inserting the Minister of Finance in 108 and 113, the proposed sections 108 and 113, I want the public to understand that the purpose of this is not to make the Minister of Finance a law unto himself, so he loom in large and in charge, but it is simply, Mr. Vice President, once he's properly positioned, it allows the access to funding to be a lot easier for these municipal corporations. Mr. Vice President, if I may now respectfully, on the same point of looking at the roles and responsibility of the Minister of Finance, if I may look at proposed section 116 and 118. Now, indeed, this is found at clause 3, paragraph AR, and section, which is section 116 of the Municipal Corporations Act. Now, Mr. Vice President, Section 116 and Section 118 refers to an important internal control in relation to cash disbursements. This includes disbursements requiring, Mr. Vice President, 2 authorized signatures on all company checks as guided by clause 116. Now, by requiring, Mr. Vice President, 2 signatures, the company is verifying that both signers agree that the payment is proper and the payment is reasonable. Now, if I may say, the requirement of these 2 signatures, Mr. Vice President, it reduces the likelihood of persons writing improper checks to themselves. It also reduces the likelihood of persons writing checks to fictitious persons or companies. So again, what you have is in this proposed section 116 and 118, again, by inserting the Minister of Finance in there, what you have is further checks and balances and oversight of the public purse and oversight of monies which are disbursed, and of course an accountability and transparency. So, Mr. Vice President, if I may respectfully say, these both provisions proposed in section 116 and the proposed section 116, proposed section 118, by inserting the Minister of Finance into this provision, what you have, you're limiting, Mr. Vice President, offenses possibly of fraud, bribery, theft, and so on. Now, and again, this is in alignment with this government's policies. It's our principal policies of transparency, accountability, Mr. Vice President, and of course, good governance. Now, Mr. Vice President, if we look at, and there's several other proposed sections in this bill. For example, if we look at proposed section 119, yes, we see the Minister of Finance placed there again. If we look at the proposed section 120, but what I have to say again, in response to Ms. Senator, and I must go back to the propaganda that Senator Mark has attempted to put on the public record, the purpose of the inserting the Minister of Finance, the purpose of it, Mr. Vice President, it is not because, one, the Minister of Finance is not operating outside of the scope of the...
Member Senators, no. All is fair in love and war, but I must bring everyone's attention to 51.1 excessive crosstalk, please. Yeah.
So you're correct, Mr. Vice President. All is fair in love and war. So I'm hoping that Senator Mark would recognize, and I'm just reminding him of things that I know he already knows, because he has been here for decades, and he understands that what we are doing is coherent and consistent with the constitutional roles of this Minister of Finance. And Senator Mark, I hope we will get your support when it comes to, voting on this bill. Mr. Vice President, how much time is full time? Mr. Vice President, how much time do I have again?
You have 15 minutes.
Oh, good. All right. So, Mr. Vice President, if I may now respectfully look at proposed section, at clause 3M. What I want to look at is briefly the Executive Council and the constitution and creation of this Executive Council, and of course deal with, if as long as time permits me, some of the policy behind the creation of this Executive Council. Now, before I delve into clause 3M, proposed section 33A, Mr. Vice President, before we start looking at the Executive Council, we must remember, Mr. Vice President, that we're retaining Section 8.1 of the Municipal Corporation Act. And Section 8.1 of the Municipal Corporation Act, it simply states that the municipal corporation structure is being that of a body corporate. So we have retained that Section 8.1, so it's still a body corporate. But then we go into Clause 3M, which is proposed Section 3A. Now, Mr. Vice President, Clause 3M, proposed Section 3A of the bill, which shall bring, in my respectful view and this government's respectful view, the reformation of the council is very, very, very critical. Now, in looking at this, municipal councils and local government, this particular council, Mr. Vice President, has the ability to do that. Now, I would start from simply looking at generally, because I know the Minister of Local Government, and of course to avoid tedious repetition, he would have gone through in some detail the structure. Now, the structure in particular, Clause 3M, Mr. Vice President, it states that the Executive Council shall comprise of a mayor, the deputy mayor, and such other councillors as aldermen, not being more than 6, and the chief executive officer, who shall be an ex officio member. So we all know that, we all can read. The question is, what is the policy? And this is the part that I'm mainly concerned with, and what I want to get into is the policy in the creation, Mr. Vice President, of this Executive Council. Now, Mr. Vice President, the selection of the Executive Council by a mayor and a chairman is one of the most revolutionary milestones, I believe, respectfully, in this local government reform. Now, Now, the inclusion, Mr. Vice President, of minority political representation will not be consonant with the spirit and intention of the policy for local government reform. And I will tell you why, Mr. Vice President. To include a minority would be damaging, and it would pose probable challenges, Mr. Vice President, to the objective of an executive council, and we are aware of that. Right in the Senate, we see the predicament that we face in sometimes passing law and getting the support of the opposition. So I'm not pulling something out of the sky. Accordingly, Mr. Vice President, this is why the remit is given to the mayor or chairman, Mr. Vice President, to determine the composition of the Executive Council, since the minority is already represented at the level of the Municipal Council in terms of its compositions. So, this, Mr. Vice President, at least is my respectful submission as to why, one of the reasons why in this particular council, we do not have that minority representation. Moreover, Mr. Vice President, because the Executive Council is the administrative arm of the corporation, the inclusion of a minority would usher, Mr. Vice President, in my respectful views, major complexities, specifically where other parties exist on that particular political trajectory. Now, in fact, Mr. Vice President, the Executive Council Section 33E of the proposed bill before us, I know Senator Holdep would have mentioned about the resemblance of this bill to the THA Act. And of course, this particular 33E of this proposed bill, it does indeed mirrors provision under Part 3 of the Tobago House of Assembly Act, Mr. Vice President. And this is especially so in Section 34, in the sense that the minority leader, Mr. Vice President, is not a part of the Executive Council of the THA. So we have not departed from structures that is already in existence. We have the Executive Council of the THA, and then we have the Minority Council. And the Minority Council is not a part of that Executive Council. And what we have done today is consonant with already existing pieces of legislation that is operating on our sister isle. Mr. Vice President, the Executive Council, as we all know, is responsible for making all the administrative decisions for the trajectory of the particular council. And we know that people will toe party lines, and this is why we have excluded the minority in order to eliminate any politics that will stand against implementing good strategies and policies that could only advance the council and the work of the municipalities. But more than that, Mr. Vice President, as I indicated before, it is also a reflection of what already exists in our Tobago House of Assembly, in our THA Act. Now, I had intended to look at the role of the CEO, but I already, I know briefly in responding to Senator John and Senator Mark at the very beginning, I would have looked at some of those, the roles of the CEO, and of course, comparing his or her role, Mr. Vice President, to that of a permanent secretary. Mr. Vice President, so in essence, this is, I want to believe this is the extent to which I would look at the Executive Council and the administration of the Executive Council. What is particularly important, Mr. Vice President, is that in the realm of local government reform, again, as a matter of policy, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, as we all know, deserves a local government machinery, Mr. Vice President, that is premised on the basis of service and delivery. And again, I want to reiterate that I believe this Executive Council will be responsible for that, because what you are looking at is the devolution of certain areas away from central government. So, of course, they would be given a level of autonomy to be able to manage their affairs. And, of course, this is evident in Clause 3M, which is the proposed Section 33E of the bill, which speaks, of course, to the responsibility of that particular Executive Council. I would have already mentioned that the creation of this Executive Council is in alignment with the other existing law position, which is the THA. One particular point that I briefly spoke about is the reduction of red tape through the creation of the Executive Council. Mr. Vice President, under proposed Section 37(1), it provides a corporation shall be responsible for the delivery of its services in respect to matters set out in the 13th schedule, such as construction, maintenance, roads, and so on. Of course, you have the Executive Council being that council which will be responsible for these deliberations. And ultimately, Mr. Vice President, in subsection 2, the provision went on to provide for the empowerment, Mr. Vice President, of the corporation to take all such steps as may be necessary or incidental to the exercise of its powers for the discharge of its duties. And what I want to respectfully say is that this will ultimately, Mr. Vice President, provide for better performances within these municipalities.
Senator,
Mr. Vice President,
you have 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Now, what I also want to remind members of the public, even though we have the creation of this Executive Council, we must remember that this Executive Council is not going to be able to run unchecked and without checks and without balances. Mr. Vice President, this one of the major checks and balances on the rules of the Executive Council and their operations is found in the Office of the Chief Executive Officer, who, pursuant to the proposed 33D, is an ex officio member. And because it's comparable, because this Chief Executive Officer is similar to what we know as a PS in a ministry, this Chief Executive Officer is also the accounting officer with the responsibility of overlooking and, having that oversight over transactions. So this is, of course, checks and balances placed on the Executive Council. And then if we look at other pieces of law, for example, the Ombudsman, which is a creature of the Constitution, Mr. Vice President, in Section 91 of our Constitution. Under the Constitution, we understand that the Ombudsman is a non-political, independent and advisory entity within whom persons within communities can make a complaint if they believe they had suffered an injustice at the hands of a public official. So I respectfully want to also say that these Executive Council, they can be held accountable by this Office of the Ombudsman, which of course exists in our Constitution. So the Executive Council, Mr. Vice President, even though will be given a level of autonomy over the operation of our council, of these corporations, we must remember that there's a level of checks and balances placed on this Executive Council, and they're not allowed to run helter-skelter, but of course will be held and will be accountable to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, briefly, Mr. Vice President, in the couple minutes that I have, if I may just briefly look at municipal police and the amendments that we have brought. Very simple amendments, but I had to look at municipal police for the mere fact that the municipal police of Trinidad and Tobago is lucky to have acting commissioner of police who carries the name of Renuka Sagramsingh-Sooklal, Mr. Vice President. That happens to be my father. So I just had to say that. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Vice President, the municipal police, of course, will play a greater role as it relates to the softer side of policing and community policing. And, of course, this is where we can see real impact happening at our community levels because, of course, this is going to be their focus. But Clause 3, proposed Section 3A1 of the Municipal Corporation Act says that each corporation, of course, shall establish a division with the following responsibilities, and of course that speaks to the municipal police. I just want to say that the creation, as we all know, of the municipal police is consonant with other international comparators. For example, we have we have over 40 countries of the world, Mr. Vice President, having a unit of municipal police. We have in Australia, who I think they're referred to as Shire Rangers or Rangers. We have Canada, and we have various countries throughout the world that recognize the role and function that municipal police can play, of course, at a community level and improving, the lives and safety and security of our citizens. Certainly, municipal police are beyond Rotten Tomato police or market police, and they will serve a critical function in, the safety of our citizens. Now, I know Clause 3, proposed Section 48(1), of course, that section speaks particularly to the Public Service Commission and the Statutory Authorities Service Commission, may in consultation with the Commissioner of Police appoint for that purpose a sufficient number of commission officers. Time, of course, may not permit me, Mr. Vice President, but just to answer the question, why 2 commissions, Mr. Vice President? The jurisdiction of the commissions are different. We need to understand that. And although they are both responsible for appointing, removing, transferring, and exercising disciplinary control, their powers do so extend to that particular jurisdiction, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, and of course, I believe that this new structure will certainly allow the government and allow the municipal police to be able to fill all of those vacancies that exist, and of course be able to continue with their mandate, which is the softer side of policing. So, Mr. Vice President, with that being said, I want to give my 100% support to this bill. Of course, this is where we can really impact lives, Mr. Vice President. And, to my fellow members of this Senate, please ensure that you're standing on the right side of history when we vote for this bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Leader of Government Business.
President, I beg to move that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, June 7th, 2022 at 10 a.m. when we propose to continue the debate on the local government reform matter.
Honorable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for one matter to be raised on the motion for the adjournment of the Senate. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have a matter entitled "The Need for the Government to Explain the Decision by the Management and Board of Directors of TSTT to send home an entire complement of estate police guards and have same replaced by private security." Mr. Vice President, we were astonished today to learn that TSTT retrenched only today. As if they knew, Mr. Vice President, I was going to come with this motion. They took the opportunity to retrench today some 30, we understand, estate police guards. Or should I put it another way, Mr. Vice President? Out of the 30 estate police guards, they have retrenched 25, and they have retained, I understand, 4, with most of them going to retire shortly. So some of them going at the end of this year and some early next year. But in addition to that, Mr. Vice President, the government has retrenched 376 senior and junior members of staff, giving us a grand total, according to a release from TTB Mobile only today, of 468 employees, almost 500 workers.
Senator Mark, you're approaching this question as an urgent matter, as opposed to approaching it as stated here on the motion on the adjournment.
No, I am saying, Mr. Vice President, my motion deals with the private security guards. And I'm saying to you that only today, over 468 workers were retrenched. Out of those numbers, Mr. Vice President, we had almost 25 estate police guard, Mr. Vice President. The question that has to be asked, Mr. Vice President, is why would TSTT want to release 26 or 27 estate police guards at this time? Mr. Vice President, would you believe that these same guards in 2018 gave up collective bargaining for a new collective agreement so that their jobs can be saved? So they were supposed to get new increases from 2018 to 2021, and they simply did not negotiate through the Estate Police Association, hoping, Mr. Vice President, that God would intervene and that somebody will put some sense into the heads of the TSTT Board of Directors and senior management. Mr. Vice President, that was not to be. So today, as we are speaking, in accordance with the Severance and Retrenchment Benefits Act, the Estate Police Association, under Section 4.1 of that Act, was served notices of retrenchment on today's date, May the 31st, 2022, affecting the workers that I've mentioned who are estate police guard. Mr. Vice President, the question that has to be asked is why? Why in a period of economic stagnation, almost depression, would a company owned 51% by the people of T&T, Trinidad and Tobago, would want to put these workers on the breadline? And Mr. Vice President, you know what is more alarming? We understand they want to bring in amalgamated security to replace these workers. So workers who have been working there for 10, 20, 30 years have now been replaced or about to be replaced by a private security outfit. Mr. Vice President, in whose interest is the government of Trinidad and Tobago working? In whose interest? It cannot be in the interest of the working people. Mr. Vice President, this is alarming. And the reason why I'm saying it is alarming, Mr. Vice President, is that for the last 4 years, according to the data I have before me, TSTT has written off over $2.5 billion because they cannot collect receivables. $2.5 billion that they cannot collect. And if they had collected that $2.5 billion, we would have been able to save the jobs of 27 estate police guards. Why is the government committing these crimes against the working class, against the family of poor people in our country? Why are they doing this? Is the government looking for the people to stand up and take action? Why are they provoking the population like this? Mr. Vice President, this is unacceptable. And Mr. Vice President, you know what is even more alarming? The government set up a team led by the Honorable Camille Robinson-Regis. They met with the Communications Workers Union. The minister was a member of that team. And they told the Communications Workers Union they are not going, that is TSTT, will not retrench anybody. TSTT will hold their hands on retrenchment until their restructuring exercise is completed. And Mr. Vice President, TSTT is a law unto itself. Lisa Agard is a law unto herself.
From Senator Mark, as you are aware, you cannot raise matters for persons who are not present.
No, you have to point to the standing order that says, I can't do that. I can't do that. I take responsibility for it. Lisa Agard is a stranger.
Senator Mark, while I just get the standing order to call for you, let me
continue, Mr. Vice President.
Kindly pause the deliberation.
Yeah. I'm very passionate about this because I'm seeing too much crime in our country.
Senator Mark, you have 1 more minute.
Too much crime. And the government is promoting crime by doing this kind of thing. And therefore, we call on the government that is in charge of TSTT to instruct TSTT to rescind that decision.
Senator Mark? Senator?
Order 46-6. Cannot do this.
Thank you, Senator Mark. Thank you very much for your contribution. 46-6 upheld. Senator Mark. Thank you. Your volume, Senator Mark. Please kindly allow me to introduce the Minister to answer your question. Minister of Public Utilities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I feel very sorry for Senator Mark. And one would think that someone in Senator Mark's position, who sat in the office of a presiding officer in Parliament, would have known how to conduct himself. Senator Mark is free. Senator Mark.
I am on my senators. The level of Senator Mark, Senator Leiter, all senators. Senator Mark, I am on my feet. Senators, we are at the 11th hour of our day today. I need for you guys to give the respect due to the person who is on his feet making his contribution. Can all observe silence and give respect? Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, I consider Senator Mark's behavior to be quite reprehensible. It is disgraceful, and he should set a better example to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, especially our young children, who expect much better of him. This is not no Monday night forum. This is the Senate of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. and his behavior is quite intolerable, very intolerable. Mr. Vice President, the restructuring exercise that has been going on in TSTT is no secret. TSTT has announced to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that it has commenced restructuring discussion with all the unions representing TSTT workers as of February of this year. 4 months of engagement in accordance with their collective bargaining agreement. What can you expect more of a company that has a responsibility to its workers to comply with the collective bargaining arrangements where its restructuring is concerned? This is not the first time TSTT has engaged in restructuring discussions. As a matter of fact, over the years, this is perhaps the 5th or 6th restructuring exercise that TSTT has engaged in. And if Senator Mark has a problem in TSTT engaging in collective bargaining arrangements or restructuring exercise concerning its workers, then the courts are always there. If TSTT is not complying with its obligation under the collective bargaining arrangements, Mr. Vice President, then the courts is always there to ventilate those issues. And time again, I come before this Parliament, in this House, and in the other place, to explain that the government is a 51% shareholder in TSTT, with 49% shareholding from another private entity. The duty of restructuring is not one for the shareholder, Mr. Vice President. And basic principles of company law would teach Senator Mark that shareholders are not engaged in restructuring exercise. It is the business of the board of directors and it is the business of the management to engage in discussions where restructuring is concerned. The responsibility of the shareholders, Mr. Vice President, is to ensure that companies are managed in such a way so that there can be greater return to all the shareholders of the company. And therefore, we expect the board of directors of TSTT and the executive management of TSTT to always act in the best interests of all the shareholders of that organization. And if the board and the executive management is of the view that the company needs to be restructured, as in fact they have said on numerous occasions, Mr. Vice President, in order to ensure a greater interest to all the shareholders, which is the people of Trinidad and Tobago, then they are free to do that. And the government, being a 51 shareholding in TSTT, ought not to get involved in that, because Senator Mark will bring another motion to argue that it is not the business of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to engage in restructuring exercise in TSTT. Mr. Vice President, I can confirm that over 27 employees represented by the EPA have been served with retrenchment notices in accordance with the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, in accordance with the collective bargaining arrangements between TSTT and all the unions representing workers of the organization. I am satisfied that TSTT continues to be counseled and get the best legal advice to allow this restructuring exercise to take place despite the fulmination of Senator Mark and his pretense of caring for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. It is a great pretense because he belongs.
Senator Mark, what point of order? What point of order? If you do not have a point of order.
Telling me that. He's out of order.
You are not to determine that, sir. You need to take your seat, sir. Mayor Senator Mark, you are on my feet. You need to take your seats. Can you
Mr.
finish
Vice
it?
President, the UNC and Senator Mark cannot pretend as though they care about the people of Trinidad and Tobago. The most corrupt thing that ever passed through Trinidad and Tobago is the UNC. So to come here and pretend as though you care about the people of Trinidad and Tobago, you are a hypocrite. And therefore, Mr. Vice President, I am quite satisfied that TSTT, its executive management, and the board of directors are complying with its obligation under the collective bargaining arrangements. And I dare say, if Senator Mark or any of his cohorts have any issue with it, then take it to the court.
Honorable Senators, Honorable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, June the 7th at 10 a.m. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, June 7th, 2022 at 10 a.m.